Well, good morning, everyone. All the veterans are here. Thank you for your service, especially for the ones from World War II. I'd like to introduce Robert Vaucher, who flew 117 combat missions in a B-24, B-25, B-17, B-18, and a B-29 bombers with the 426 Bomb Group. His aircraft was formation leader of 525 planes that flew over the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri. He received the first B-29 off the production line for war, flew the longest mission of World War II, that's 4,030 miles, and was the first person to fly a B-29 at an altitude greater than 38,000 feet. He flew the first bombing mission of the war, as well as the last. Please welcome Robert Vaucher.
Thank you for that generous introduction. You left out a couple of things. One was my call sign, my combat call sign that I used when I assembled formations to go to the bombing target. My call sign was, "This is Victor Abel, Uncle Charlie. How easy, Roger, calling you on 710. And I might, at a later time, say, "This is Victor Abel, Uncle Charlie. How easy, Roger, calling all chickens to the hen house." And that meant we were on the way into the target. Another thing you left out is that I am a war baby. That is, of World War I. I was born shortly after the armistice of the famous 9th month, 9th day, and 9th year of 1917, when the armistice was signed. I was conceived about 8 months before that because my father's conscription number was coming up and they thought it was time to get going. I was born in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, on the Mexican border on a citrus ranch, and we were on the edge of civilization. Now, have any of you read Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation? That perfectly describes me. He describes the average GI as somebody who had lived in one place the entire life, hadn't gone much out of the boundaries of the county, and down where we were, you only went into town, which was 9 miles away. It was 6 miles of a single lane dirt road, and in the first 5 or 6 years of my life, we went into town in a box wagon pulled by 2 beautiful mules. It was 3 hours into town. At the 6 mile line, we came across a semi-paved road where you did see a car now and then. On average, you saw about 9 wagons to 1 car. Shopping in town was a 3-hour trip. First, you went to the hardware store to get provisions for the ranch. Then you went to the drugstore to get some patent medicine. Then you went to the grocery store, and there was, of course, no frozen food, nothing cold. It was all dry food, like flour and canned goods, pork and beans and so forth. And then the last stop was at the White House, at the ice house, to get a 100-pound block of ice. And in the box wagon there was a bed of hay, and we put the 100-pound piece of ice in there, and that was our ice for the next couple of weeks, because you didn't go into town shopping but once every 2 to 3 weeks. Well, that Brokaw pretty much describes us as being really an unusual background for most of the kids, whether they were born here in this town, they practically never got out of town. They were born in Pittsburgh, they only knew Pittsburgh. That World War II completely changed that. 17 years after I was born, Franklin Roosevelt, in his 1935 inaugural address, said, quote, "To some generations much is given, to other generations much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny." A rendezvous with destiny. I'm talking about 1935, right in the middle of the Depression. These words were cast on the backdrop of the winds of war that had reached gale force. Japan was flexing its power in Asia, Stalin was solidifying the revolution with persecutions, and Hitler had taken complete control of Germany. Mussolini had taken over Italy, and Franco of Spain was stroking the Spanish Revolution. And most of the rest of the world was in economic turmoil because of the Great Depression. The military services were budgeted at a skeleton force, just enough to keep them going. The national consciousness was of the country was 90% were isolationists. They thought that all these wars were being fought and we weren't concerned, didn't have to worry about anything. However, there were a few visionaries. My generation, a few visionaries preparing my generation for that rendezvous with destiny. That was General Hap Arnold and General George Marshall. General Hap Arnold instituted the Flying Club of America. The idea was to create a pool of youth with aviation, some aviation technology and enthusiasm. I joined in the 8th grade. We got a pair of wings, built model airplanes, and a newsletter now and then. In around 1935, Arnold wrote a book called The Flying Game, and that became the Bible for many of us. General Marshall then created the Citizens Military Training Camp, the CMTC, about 1936, to build a pool of youth with some military training. As a teen, I went 2 summers to boot camp, training at Camp Willis, Texas in the hot month of August. During one mock military maneuver, our artillery, I was in the artillery, was pinpointed in Poison Oak by a mock enemy plane. I said to myself, those guys will be back at base in San Antonio, shower, go to dinner, and take the friend to the movies. And here I am, pinned down in a bed of Poison Oak, missed my lunch, and probably will have K rations for dinner. Right then and there, I decided to become a pilot. The Air Corps required a college degree, so off I went to what is now known as the University of Texas, Pan American. The winds of war were now at hurricane force. March 14th, Hitler annexed Czechoslovakia, Mussolini invaded Albania, and in September 1, Hitler invaded Poland, and so isolationists even continue to persist despite all that. Then Arnold created a civilian pilot training program in 1940. You received college credits for the ground school and a free flight training for 4 of us signed up by the end of our second year, and we ended up with a pilot's license. In 1940, Norway fell to Denmark and Belgium fell to Germany, and the Germans entered Paris. Peace in our times, Neville Chamberlain was kicked out of office and replaced by Churchill as Prime Minister of England. And in his first speech, he said, "My first speech as Prime Minister, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." That was his whole speech. By mid-1940, the Air Corps offered a limited number of openings for pilot training to candidates with 2 years of college. I jumped in and graduated in April 1941 and was assigned then to the elite bomb group, 2nd Bomb Group in Langley Field, Virginia. That was where all the theory of bombing was being developed. This was a defining point in my life. The operation officer of the unit was a Captain LeMay, who you probably remember was head of the Strategic Air Force and then became chairman of the Combined Chief of Staff. 3 months later, I was assigned to a flight of 3 British LB-30 bombers to take them to Java. They were at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, being fitted with revolutionary development called radar. After a couple of weeks, the crew started asking me when I was going to get some flight training and get checked out on the plane. So I went to the commanding officer of the unit, a full colonel, and a full colonel was like a general as far as we were concerned, and asked him when I could be checked out as the crews were getting antsy. His reply was, "Lieutenant, you're from Texas, aren't you?" "Yes, sir." "You graduated from flying school, didn't you?" "Yes, sir." "So you learned to fly?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then you can fly that plane. Besides, there's nobody else around here who has ever flown it. Some limeys flew them in here, but they are long gone. You're on your own." It was a 4-engine LB-30 bomber, which was similar to the B-24 bomber. I had never flown an airplane with a tricycle landing gear. I'd only seen one before that, and that was the first Constellation that came out, and I saw it on at the tarmac at an airport. And that was it. The co-pilot and I studied the manual for several days, and off we went into the wild blue yonder. A few weeks later, we and the LB-30s, the LB-30 was a 4-engine bomber, were off to Darwin, Australia. 1 hour before departure, I was instructed to take the flight of 3 airplanes to Panama and wait for instructions because Java had fallen to the Japs. Shortly, there came a red alert after we landed in Panama, and they expected a Japanese attack, a Pearl Harbor-like attack on Panama. So we were sent out on a search mission. Imagine being sent out on a search mission, and 1 year later, you're still being sent out on a search mission. That soon turned into daily patrol, and we ended up stationed in Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, Panama, and the Galapagos Islands. Now comes my affair with the B-29. After flying search missions in North Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the near Pacific, I had accumulated about 1,000 hours in 4-engine bombers. At that time, only a handful of people had 1,000 hours in a 4-engine bomber. Suddenly, I was sent back to the U.S. to a fast-track command and staff school, which was pretty heavy stuff for a first lieutenant. I had no idea that General Arnold was beginning to put together the organization to run the B-29 program. Thus, had ordered the worldwide return of experienced people to form the command. So the first B-29s that went into combat, most of them were manned by people who had already had a pretty good stretch of war experience. In 1938, Arnold realized that if Britain fell, the B-17 could not reach Germany from the available vantage points. So more range was needed. They came up with the B-29 specifications of 5,000 miles and carried 2,000 pounds of bombs. Boeing got the contract, but it wasn't until 1942 that the airplane came off the line. This started in 1938. About 2 months later, I ended up in Pratt, Kansas in a large hangar being briefed and inspecting the largest production plane in the world. The B-29 was a quantum leap over any previous production bomber. It was a big thing, 141 feet, half the length of a football field. It had 90-some motors in it. It weighed 80,000 pounds. We actually overloaded them by 58,000 pounds. It had 4 Wright 3350 engines combined to 8,800 horsepower. It was pressurized at 8,000 feet. This This was the beginning of pressurized airplanes. It had a fuel capacity of 5,500 gallons of high octane gas, which equated to 33,000 pounds of fuel alone. So I was advised, or we were advised, that it didn't fly like anything we'd ever flown before, but flew somewhat like a B-26. Somebody here from a B-26 group. So off to Del Rio, Texas to get B-26 training. After 10 or so landings, I was now ready to take on the B-29, and to my surprise, a Boeing test pilot checked me out after 2 hours and 15 minutes, and I was off to Wichita Boeing plant to pick up the first production B-29 officially delivered to the Air Corps. There was also another pilot on the assignment. I was designated first pilot as I had 15 minutes more time than he did. Now, he outranked me. He was a captain and I was a first lieutenant, so that was kind of a switch. I took off for Pratt, Kansas, and an odyssey that lasted another 2.5 years for me and the world. When we started testing in Kansas, we didn't have a clue that so many problems would be encountered. This was the first plane to go into full-scale production without 2 to 5 years of testing before production. Well over 3,000 problems had to be solved. So July 1943 to April of 1944 were dubbed the Battle of Kansas. We were in a state of discovery while debugging and trying to learn how to use the plane. In April 1943, we were off to combat. Our destination was a well-kept secret, and we didn't know until the last leg of our trip. It was about halfway around the world. Roosevelt had, so our destination was the CBI China, Burma, India. CBI standard for China, Burma, India theater. And there was no other location from which the B-29 could reach Japan. The Mariana Islands had not yet been taken. If you know the history of the B-29, that was later. No theater in the world could have been rougher proving ground than China, Burma, India. Sustaining the bomber command was a logistic nightmare. All supply foods and fuel and bombs had to be shipped by sea to Calcutta, India, then trucked 100 or so miles up to our Assam Valley base. And because the bases in China could not be adequately defended from the Japanese, we could not have our B-29s based there on a permanent basis and be sitting ducks. So all operations out of China were on a hit-and-run basis. Supplies had to be air transported from India over the hump, the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world, and the worst weather, and no landing fields, and no weather predictions. In the course of it, we lost 23 B-29s, and in the course of the whole thing with the Air Transport Commandment, they lost 450 airplanes over the hump. And there are books written on just on over the hump flying. By this time, we moved from the CBI to the Tinian Island. The services had taken the Mariana Islands, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. And that became the base for the 20th Air Force onslaught of Japan. In the meantime, I had mined the Mosai River in Sumatra. I had bombed the locks in Singapore, the railroad yards in Bangkok, key modification centers in Formosa, steel mills in Korea, supply depots in Manchuria, and steel mills in Yawata, Japan, an aircraft factory in Amur, Japan. And along the way, my commanding officer was shot down, and the operation officer, Colonel Roush, was also shot down, and I was selected to take Colonel Roush's place and promoted to lieutenant colonel. April of 1945, we, the 20th Bomber Command, were transferred to Tinian and reactivated as the 58th Bomb Wing under General Ramey. General Ramey was an old-timer. He was one of the South Pacific generals in the early part of the war. The awesome Empire program blitz on Japan started in May and was ratcheted up from weekly missions to daily missions. We had B-29s over Japan every day of the week. LeMay at this point had 1,000 B-29s at his disposal. I was now in the big league, and I was air commander for wings and combined wings. One was the May 29, 1945 Yokohama mission, which was the longest in-trail 254 B-29, and we destroyed the target with 2,500 tons of bombs. My most dramatic mission was on June 5th, 45, and it was a faulted plan. My deputy, second in command, was shot down. My co-commander was shot down, and I was almost shot down. I managed to get back to Iwo Jima on a wing and a prayer. And I met a gentleman this morning that was a P-51 pilot out of Iwo, and I had all these years, almost 70 years, I had always wanted to meet some of the fighter pilots out of Iwo, and I met one this morning. I can't think of his name right now. Jerry Yellen. Jerry, would you stand up, because this guy flew fighters out of Iwo Jima, and
my big brother.
And I escorted a lone P-51 from Japan back to Iwo one time, and he claims he knows who I escorted.
Yeah.
That's 70 years ago. That's interesting. I'll get you on here in a minute. Incidentally, the airplane I landed at Iwo, I had no way of getting another 800 miles to Tinian. We left it there and it was scrapped. It never flew again. We counted 400 holes in it, and the only injury we had for 11 people in the crew was one fella had part of a finger severed from flak, and that's what shot us down, was flak. We lost 11 B-29s on that mission. August 5th, 1945 completely changed our lives. Hiroshima was A-bombed. All of us who had been through 14 months of hell were awed, I mean awed, by the damage reports that came in. We sent airplanes to photograph what happened. We couldn't believe that one airplane dropped one bomb and destroyed 7 square miles. On this mission that I mentioned earlier, of 254 B-29s, we did 7 square miles with 2,200 tons of bombs. When the atomic bomb was dropped, Japan was dead in the water. We had dropped 12,000 mines in all the waters, all the ports. They couldn't get ships in, they couldn't get ships out. Their shipping was there, and they depended very heavily on shipments of food and provisions from China and Korea. We actually sent planes out ahead of our bombing missions and dropped leaflets on 5 cities, and our intention was and the leaflet said, "Get out of town, we're going to bomb you day after tomorrow." And what we'd do is we would bomb 3 of those 5 so that the Japanese wouldn't target us. However, they were sending nothing up after us. We had nothing, they had no opposition the last month of the war. They were dead in the water. In summary, August 1, 1945, the day before the atomic bomb was dropped, we had lost 500 B-29s in combat and 250 in training. That 250 in training is incredible by today's standard. 66 cities were virtually all the economic significance of Japan, and they had suffered destruction ranging from 25 to 90%. We had placed 12,000 mines in the ports. The atomic bomb attack speeded up the decision of the Japanese leaders to quit. General LeMay, who had predicted back in May that the war would be over by November, and he didn't know about the atomic bomb, was absolutely right. If there's time for any questions, I'll be glad. So this is Victor Abel, Uncle Charlie, How Easy Roger, over and out. Thank you. Have you any questions?
What was your last mission?
Your last mission.
What was the last mission? The last mission was the best mission I ever went on. I had the honor of leading the Air Force in review over the battleship Missouri, 525 B-29s, and we had an additional 150 to 200 Navy ships also on it. And the reason it was, and they considered it a combat mission. I got credit. Up to that time, I had 29 combat missions in B-29, and they declared that a combat mission, so I have 30 combat missions in a B-29. And the reason I say it was the best mission I ever went on, we had no bombs and no ammunition. Thank you.